Star Trek, Mission to Horatius, Chapter 2, Mystery plus Mystery. Captain Kirk said, "Mr. Chekhov, go to my quarters. On my desk you'll find a tape. Please bring it here." "Yes, sir." The ensign made his way toward the turbolift elevator, the door of which slid open at his approach and closed automatically behind him. Those remaining behind on the bridge waited it out. The captain flicked an intercom switch and said, "Mr. Scott, we have arrived at our destination. We'll drop out of space warp and remain at these coordinates until further orders are determined." Scott's voice came through. "Aye, sir." Chekhov returned, having obviously made every effort at speed. He laid the message container before his commanding officer and stepped back, his youthful Slavic face as inquisitive as any of the others on the ship's bridge. The captain broke the seal on the container, brought forth the tape, inserted it deftly in a scanner, which he then activated. He stared down into the screen and almost immediately scowled. "The Sun System Horatius," he said, looking up. "Mr. Spock?" The Vulcan raised his strangely shaped eyebrows. "I do not believe I have ever heard of it, Captain." "Which surprises me, Mr. Spock. Horatius. I can't even think of the source of the name." The science officer was on firmer ground now. "A legendary Roman hero, sir. The story is that when the Etruscans, under Lars Porsena, were attempting to capture Rome, there was only a single bridge crossing the Tiber River, and the Etruscans were advancing rapidly. The sole chance was to cut the bridge down before the enemy could overrun it. Horatius and two companions—" "Just a minute, Mr. Spock," the captain broke in. "We will take your word for it." The captain returned to the perusal of his orders. He looked up at last, his face very thoughtful. "Our instructions, briefly, are to proceed to the star system Horatius and investigate the subspace distress call received by Starfleet Command." "Who issued the distress signal, Captain?" Spock asked. Kirk frowned. "It was evidently cut off before that was revealed. However, the call came through in Earth Basic, which would indicate a planet settled by humans. Please check the computer banks, Mr. Spock." Spock bent over his library computer station, peering into the hooded screen, muttering orders, occasionally flicking controls. In a surprisingly short period of time, he raised his head, his face registering uncharacteristic amazement. "Very interesting," he said. "I am sure, Mr. Spock," the captain said dryly. "But will you let us in on your newfound knowledge?" "It would seem, Captain, that there is very little information in the computer banks on the Horatian system. It is at the very extreme of this quadrant. Its very discovery in the early days of space travel was an accident. A small freighter inadvertently fell out of space warp and into underspace. When its crew managed to force the ship back into warp, it materialized near Horatius and set down on one of the 3 Class M planets which orbit the Sun." "3?" Kirk said. "Yes, sir. Later they were named Neolithia, Mithra, and Bavaria, but to resume, the space freighter was forced to remain until the necessary repairs were made. The star was reported and charted, but since it remained in such a far sector, in a direction not being exploited by the Federation, it was largely ignored." Captain Kirk was scowling. "But a distress signal in Earth Basic has come from there." "Yes, sir. Evidently, although the Federation has not reached out to that point, human colonists have. In fact, the Horatian star system was settled by people who wished to avoid contact with the Federation." "But why?" Lieutenant Uhura asked. Spock looked at the dark-complexioned communications officer. "The information is sketchy, Lieutenant, but it would seem that the colonists of the Horatian system are not in sympathy with Federation ways and have fled to such a distant sector to escape them." All present were looking at him blankly. Dr. McCoy snorted. "Why? Are they insane?" Spock shrugged and looked back briefly into the hooded screen. "The group that first settled and named their planet Neolithia evidently wished to return to nature and abandon the highly technical civilization that exists on the Federation worlds. The second group seemed somewhat similar to the Pilgrims who settled New England. That is, they wished to find a place where they could worship without interference." Captain Kirk said, "That's nonsense. There are no restrictions on religious matters in the Federation. Why, General Order Number 1 specifically states that no starship shall interfere with the political, economic, or religious systems of any world. Spock said, However, Captain, suppose religion was at a ball. I am afraid that my studies of comparative religion are not quite as wide as yours, Mr. Spock, and once again I must mention that you continue to amaze me with your knowledge of the small planet of my birth. Who was Baal? The chief god of the Phoenicians, Captain. His followers were obligated to throw their firstborn child into the flaming maw of Baal as a human sacrifice. Uhura, ever sensitive, closed her eyes as if in pain. Go ahead, Mr. Spock, the captain said impatiently. That accounts for 2 of the planets, and the third? Spock glanced back into the hooded screen of his library computer and frowned. Bavaria, most recently settled of all, evidently only half a century or so ago. 1,000 colonists, no more, political nonconformists, and that is practically all we know of them. Dr. McCoy said, Why all the secrecy? Why all the nonsense of waiting until we reach this point before disclosing the orders? The captain had been looking back into his tape scanner. That is at least partially explained, Bones. Although not members of the Federation, all 3 of the Horatian planets were colonized by Earthlings, and thus we have a moral obligation. However, Starfleet Command is not as yet ready to expand in this direction, and is aware of the fact that if either the Romulan Confederation or the Klingon Empire thought we were doing so, they might hurry their own exploration. This whole expedition is top secret, and very few persons, even at Starfleet Command, know that we are on our way. He turned and spoke to the navigator. What is the listing for the Horatian group on the star chart of this quadrant? The system is NGC 434, sir. Very well. Mr. Akrumah, lay a course for NGC 434, warp factor 6. Aye, sir, bearing of 37, mark 211, sir. Very well, Mr. Akrumah. Dr. McCoy growled, Months! Approximately a dozen off-watch personnel were sprawled lethargically about the wardroom. 4 of them were playing cards, some were reading, and a couple were playing chess. The rest were slumped in chairs, talking a bit, but largely staring blankly at nothing in particular. Lieutenant DePaul threw his cards to the table in disgust. That's it, he snarled. No more canasta for me. What kind of a game is it when Dick here sits next to me and draws 6 wild cards to my 1? What good is a game that's 9/10 luck? One of the others protested. It's one of the few games left that we're not sick and tired of. Ha! DePaul snorted. You can add it to the list as far as I'm concerned. What do you say we go back to poker? Poker? Ensign Chekhov grunted. What good is poker if you can't bet? And you know the regulations against gambling in space. How about looking at some tri-dye shows? Somebody suggested listlessly. Security officer Masaryk growled, Tri-dye shows? You won't have to show them. I can describe every one on board by heart. I've seen them 50 times over. Lieutenant DePaul said, Somebody hand me that tape. 1001 popular games down through the centuries. We've got to kill time some way. He slapped the tape into a scanner, but nobody seemed very hopeful that he would come up with anything. Lieutenant Uhura, who had been softly strumming on her specially made 5-string guitar on the other side of the compartment, said softly, I read once that killing time isn't murder, it's suicide. Chekhov snorted. You don't kill time on the Enterprise these days. It dies a slow death from boredom. DePaul, scanning the tape book, said, Gin Rummy. Did we ever play Gin Rummy? On the cruise before last, somebody groaned. We played it until it ran out of our ears. I'm as tired of that as you are of canasta. Lieutenant Chang called over to Uhura. How about a song? There ought to be something to cheer us up. Everyone seemed in favor of that. Uhura smiled as she strummed louder, and a soft, faraway gentleness came into her eyes. She began an age-old folk song. One of the guitar strings went ping. Oh, good heavens, she complained. That's my last spare. She twisted her lovely mouth into a And Commander Scott tells me that we're so low on some materials that he won't be able to manufacture new ones for me. Well, dear children, from now on any music from this box is played on 4 strings. Oh, great, somebody muttered. I think I'll read a while, Ensign Freeman said lackadaisically. Read? DePaul said. Read what? We've all read everything in the recreational library 3 times over. It hasn't been replenished for well over a year, and I simply don't have the gumption these days to wade through technical books the way the chief engineer seems to be able to. Science Officer Spock left the elevator and hurried over to his position at the library computer station. A planet loomed in the large bridge viewing screen. Captain Kirk, already in his command chair, said to his first officer, "The planet Neolithia, Mr. Spock." "Yes, sir." Spock took his chair and began throwing switches, touching controls. Captain Kirk said, "Mr. Sulu, go into standard orbit, please. 20,000-mile perigee." "Aye, aye, sir." Kirk said, "Lieutenant Uhura, open the hailing frequencies." "Aye, aye, sir." Sulu said, "Standard orbit, sir. 20,000-mile perigee." "Thank you, Mr. Sulu. Lieutenant Uhura?" "No response, sir." "Sir?" The captain looked at her. "Yes?" "Captain, there seem to be no radio emanations whatsoever." Kirk scowled and looked at the navigator. "This is the planet Neolithia?" "Yes, sir. That is, if the scanty information we have on the Horatian system is correct, sir." "Mr. Spock, your sensors on this, please." "Yes, sir." Spock's long, agile fingers raced. Shortly, the Vulcan's face registered rare surprise. "Most unusual," he muttered. He touched other controls. "Well, Mr. Spock?" Spock turned to his commanding officer. "Sir, it would seem that not only is the planet below completely lacking any radio emanations whatsoever, but it has never had them." "Don't be ridiculous, Mr. Spock. Neolithia is settled by human colonists." Spock said nothing. The captain, scowling, flicked a screen control. The screen increased magnification many times until the view was as clear as if the Enterprise hovered no more than a mile or so above the surface. The scene couldn't have appeared more Earth-like, but it was as an Earth of centuries past. It could have been, perhaps, Kansas, in an age before the white man made his appearance, indeed, before the Indians had acquired horses and thus achieved the ability to pursue the vast herds of buffalo, elk, deer, and antelope. There were no signs of human habitation, neither cities, towns, villages, nor the smallest of hamlets. "Mr. Spock, atmosphere analysis?" Spock said slowly, "Captain, most unusual. The atmosphere is Earth-like. Nitrogen, oxygen, with traces of argon, krypton, and neon. Temperature 75 degrees Fahrenheit. Gravitational force identical to that of Earth. However, Captain, the sensors detect one oddity." "Well, Spock?" The science officer looked at him strangely. "Sir, there are no signs of what was once called smog, no traces of man-made industrial fumes, the burning of fossil fuels such as coal and oil." "What are you suggesting, Mr. Spock?" "This planet is not inhabited by mankind, Captain." "You are jumping to conclusions. Radiation? Perhaps their civilization utilizes nuclear power." "None whatsoever, Captain, and had they ever, there would be at least traces in the atmosphere." The captain's eyes went back to the viewing screen. He touched controls and swept over a larger area. The scene below changed little, though for the next 15 minutes they scanned plains, lakes, rivers, mountains. "Are you suggesting," Kirk finally snapped at his first officer, "that the colony has been wiped out?" "I would not know, sir," Spock said simply. "But as you see, there are no signs below of destruction such as would necessarily result from wholesale devastation." The captain came to a snap decision and rose to his feet. "Mr. Sulu, have the transport room stand by and prepare to accompany us. Mr. Spock, you, Ensign Chekhov, Yeoman Doris Atkins, and—" Dr. McCoy had entered toward the end of the conversation. He said, "Jim?" The captain looked at him. "Yes, Bones? I had intended you to accompany us, but you seemed so wrapped up in your pursuit of space Cafford symptoms that I thought you wouldn't feel you could be spared." "Yes, Jim," the doctor said testily. "However, I was about to suggest that you limit your group to 5 persons and take along a specimen container. In view of the mysterious qualities of this supposedly inhabited planet, perhaps it would be well if Mr. Spock could return to the ship with some local flora and fauna, as well as soil and mineral samples. Analysis might indicate what has happened to the original colonists." "Your point's well taken, Bones. Mr. Spock?" "Very good, Captain. I'll arrange for the container."